come about. But something, if you think about the generation of Jews that came over and were peddlers, my grandfather, a peddler, in Judaism, an honorable calling. An honorable calling. Traveled from town to town. Welcomed wherever he went. Now, today, most people think, peddler, you're going to knock on somebody's door, you're bothering them, you're disturbing them. That's not what used to happen to Grandpa Lapin. They used to like it when he used to knock on the door. So I will give you through a Jewish lens what life was like for Grandpa Lapin, and I'll save all the disappointments, and I'm going to compress a long and grueling day into the next 60 seconds. But Grandpa Lapin would knock on the door of a house, and the lady would come to the door and he'd say, "Hi, do you have anything here you don't need?" And she'd say, "Well, we've got a sort of table. We've replaced our dining room table. We've got an old table downstairs. We're getting rid of that." He says, "Really? How are you getting rid of it?" She says, "The city's coming by to pick it up on Wednesday." He says, "Do they do it for free?" She says, "No, of course not. They're going to charge $5. He says, "I'll tell you what. You help me load it on my wagon or my truck here, and I'll give you $5. She says, "Well, that's a deal." They load it up on the wagon, and Grandpa Lapin trundles off with their table. At this point, if we did a quick financial statement on this family, they are better off by how much? $10. Okay. On most campuses, they say $5. And so this is fun. So Grandpa Lapin stops at the hardware store, spends $1 and some paint and a few nails, knocks on the next house. Again, I'm leaving out all the people that weren't home and the people who didn't want anything. We're just moving along quickly here. Knocks on the next house. "Hey, anybody here want a table?" And the woman says, "Well, just a moment. My daughter's getting married in 2 weeks' time. Agatha?" Agatha comes running up. She says, "Do you need a table?" She says, "Well, we're actually going to buy a table at Ethan Allen." My Grandpa Lapin says, "How much are you going to pay for it?" She says, $20. He says, "Well, I got one on my wagon you can have for $10. Now, mind you, it had some scratches and one leg was loose, but I put some nails in, gave it a new coat of paint. She says, "Let me take a look at it." She comes out and takes a look. She says, "Yeah, this will do for a starter table." And they carry the table in and they give Grandpa Lapin $10. Now, how much better off does the financial statement of the second family show they are? Also $10. So now we're better off on aggregate. The village is better off by $20. Well, no, you forgot the dollar in the till of the hardware store. And you've also forgotten the arbitrage. How much has Grandpa Lapin got in his pocket? $4. Still. And there's always somebody in an audience, not an audience like this, but at a university audience, there's usually somebody who thinks this is smoke and mirrors and that I've somehow played fast with the figures here. I haven't. It's very, very simple. I'm about to give you the finest economic definition of one of the most successful companies on the internet that made money from day number one. I'm referring to eBay. The best definition of eBay is 70,000 Grandpa Lapins working simultaneously. That's all it is. It's the greatest peddler in the world. All it does is finds people who want to rather get some money instead of the whatever it is that they've got sitting in their garage. So they're better off at the end of that transaction. And then it finds somebody who wants to give money in exchange for that particular thing because it's exactly what they want and it makes them better off. And guess what? There's an arbitrage. eBay's got a few dollars in their pocket as well, just like Grandpa Lapin. That's how it works. And so there is this deep conviction that by engaging in commerce, you're doing something good and you're doing something wonderful and you're doing something helpful for people. And so it was no surprise to Grandpa Lapin and to his descendants that when he knocked on the door to offer a transaction, people responded warmly and enthusiastically because somehow mysteriously, after he had passed through, everybody felt better off because they actually were. Exactly so. When you do something for another human being, and there is an exchange that takes place, everybody is better off. That is not a hard thing to understand. And this thing is rooted within the morality of the biblically based Judeo-Christian system. And that's why it is, both in the Lord's language, which is Hebrew, which was well known to most of the founders of our country, was well known to most of the colonial clergymen, one of whom Cotton Mather used to refer to Yale as our New England Beit Midrash. Beit Midrash is the Hebrew word for house of study. They were very, very familiar with these texts, very familiar. And I do believe that had a lot to do with the United States of America becoming the world's greatest engine of prosperity and freedom. You don't really have to say prosperity and freedom for people in the know, because people in the know those two always go together. And so it's no wonder, because within Hebrew, and by the way, it's been retained in English, we use exactly the same word for how to treat a customer as how to worship God. This past weekend, you might have attended a worship service. And if you go to Seattle, or maybe you don't have to go as far as Seattle, but you go somewhere where there's a Nordstrom store and you buy a pair of shoes, you will find that as you want to try on a pair of shoes, without feeling that he's engaging in anything menial whatsoever, the salesman does this in front of you, right here. And he's down on his knees changing your shoe. That's called customer service. Because if you please one of God's children, then you're obviously pleasing God as well. Now, my wife and I have been blessed with 7 children, and so we've experienced something over the years that most of you probably your families are immune to. Our family's just been really rough on this, and that is bickering and squabbling between siblings when they're little. And one of the great delights of watching them get a little bit older is when that fades away and they start taking care of one another. And it's hard to measure the joy as a parent when you see your children relating to one another with closeness and compassion and consideration. It's wonderful. And so for me, it's no mystery that in the same way that as a father, I'm thrilled when all my kids take care of one another, that our Father in heaven should be thrilled and delighted and get a great big smile on his face when he sees somebody take care of a customer in a store. Well, yeah, that makes sense. And somebody might say, well, he's doing it for profit. Again, in the culture of the Torah, actions trump intent. Our belief is that only the good Lord himself knows what lies inside the hearts of men. How can I possibly attribute a motive to you when I barely know why I do things myself sometimes? And so the notion that I can discredit the virtue of your action because your motive might be selfish, well, you only have to ask yourself, would you rather have a next-door neighbor who deep in his heart really, really loves you, but he keys your car and kicks your kids and kills your cat, but he really, really loves you? Or would you like a next-door neighbor who deep in his heart's not really sure how he feels about Jews or Southerners or academics or whatever you are, but my goodness, for the last 15 years, what a great neighbor you got. What would you rather have? Actions trump intentions. And so if somebody is taking care of you in the store, and yes, he's hoping to get a tip, he's hoping to make a profit or whatever it is, what's that got to do with anything? The action is taking care of another one of God's children. And so we've got to understand that what's going on is a recognition that the process of economic interaction is deeply linked to the process of relationships between human beings. And our understanding there is that we live in a world that somehow or another appears to have been created somehow for the purpose of bonding and connection. The good Lord creates a world with about 110 elements. Well, a little more than that as of last weekend. They keep cropping up. But basically, 110 elements. And you look around you today, and I would bet that there is probably not a single element that has played a useful part in your life today or yesterday. Anything that's played a useful part in your life has always been a mixture of elements, a bonding of elements. The very air you breathe is oxygen and nitrogen. The water we drink is hydrogen and oxygen. Iron is an element, but it's not good for much more than making cast iron lawn ornaments. If you want to build a machine, you need steel. Steel is a big, complicated compound. It's a mixture of everything. And so we go all the way to something as simple as salt. Salt was something that played a role in the sacrifices in the temple. That is why, by the way, that in the Western tradition, this is not true in Africa, it's not true in Asia, but in the Western tradition, we put salt on the table, and this is how it's been since the very beginning of Western thought. Salt on the table, why? Our bodies need all kinds of minerals, but nobody says, excuse me, could you pass the iron filings, please? Your body needs iron. Your body needs potassium. Can anybody see the potassium flakes, please? Could you pass them down to this end of the table? No, because all the minerals you need, you get from the food you eat. And that's true for salt as well. Any doctor will tell you, you don't need to add salt. So why do they put salt on the table? Because there was always this understanding that the table was a miniature altar. It was a place where people got together, not just to feed their bodies, but to also partake of a soul-expanding experience. And if it's going to represent the old altar in the temple, then it needs salt as well, and that's what they did. But why did salt play a role in it? What's the point of salt? Well, salt is a perfect example of God's blueprint of connectivity, where you can take two toxic substances like sodium and chlorine, each on its own, a real problem. I mean, you might say, why don't we just put shakers on the table labeled sodium, chlorine? And then you could say, when your chicken soup comes, you could say, pass the chlorine, I'm on a low-sodium diet. The trouble is it would kill you, because chlorine is as toxic as sodium is. But mysteriously, with the alchemy of relationships and the alchemy of bonding, even toxic things become tasty and benevolent. So it is possible to take a toxic thing like a single male, bond him to a single female, and all of a sudden you've created something benevolent, which is why it is that God, during the beginning of Genesis, appears to be a very good-natured deity. I mean, everything's good. Whatever he makes is good. And the very first time he turns grumpy is when he says, not good for what? Not good for man to be alone. Because we're in a world where things depend on bonding and things depend on connectivity. Does God want us to have great sex? Well, I cannot pretend to really know the inner workings of God's mind when it comes to these matters. I really don't know. But